Good day, everyone. For this presentation, the title of my report would be The Land of Compromise, Examining the Gaps in Thailand's Bamboo Diplomacy Tradition. I'm Aaron Aldrich Guevara, currently an MA student at the UP Asian Center, taking an MA in Asian Studies. Geography has always played a primary role in Thai foreign relations. Located in the heart of mainland Southeast Asia, Thailand is surrounded by borders of Malaysia in the south, Myanmar on its western and northeastern boundaries, Laos on its north and east borders, and finally, Cambodia on its southeast. Thus, Thailand is geopolitically and economically significant not only for the regional community, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, but also the global community. This presentation will raise the following research questions. First, what are the motives behind Thailand's tradition of bamboo diplomacy? Second, how has Thailand's foreign policy grounded on bamboo diplomacy developed through time? And the third research question, how effective is Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition as a foreign policy strategy? Similarly, the presentation will look into these sub-questions. First, in the present context of global politics in which US-China relations is still tense, can Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition still be considered as an effective foreign policy strategy? Second, is there a deviation from the bamboo diplomacy tradition under the government of Prayut Chan-o-cha, the current Prime Minister of Thailand, or is it still reinforced? For the research objectives, in line with the research questions, the presentation has the following objectives. First, emphasize that aside from the ostensible goal to preserve national security and national survival, Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition is heavily inclined towards status projection vis-a-vis Thailand's position in the global hierarchy of powers. Second, provide an overview on the history of Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition. By reviewing its history, the research will scrutinize how bamboo diplomacy has responded to world hegemony, external threats, and domestic political structure through time. And finally, the research intends to scrutinize the gaps of Thailand's tradition of bamboo diplomacy as the nation makes sense of the world and position itself within a changing global community. Okay, for this section, the art of Thai diplomacy, we would answer the research question, what are the motives behind Thailand's tradition of bamboo diplomacy? To begin our discussion, it is vital to explore the dominant portrayal of Thai diplomacy. Arn Kislenko likens the foreign policy of Thailand to the ancient Siamese proverb of bamboo in the wind. Similar to a bamboo, Thai foreign policy is depicted to be always solidly rooted, but flexible enough to bend whichever way the wind blows in order to survive. More than a survival strategy, this proverb is reflective of Thailand's long-revered philosophical approach to international relations, the principles of which are much enshrined in Thai culture and religion. Historically, Thailand's foreign policy has been described as an act of counterbalancing, a manifestation of the astuteness of Thailand's leaders. True to the bamboo analogy, Thailand's foreign relations have always demonstrated great flexibility and pragmatism. Several early kingdoms were extremely proficient in using diplomacy to help unite the Thai people and overcome larger kingdoms of Khmer and Bagan. With the arrival of European powers in Southeast Asia, the need for a shrewd foreign policy was even greater. Under the Ayutthaya Empire, Thailand's predominant Thai kingdom from roughly the middle of the 14th century until its collapse in 1767, the kingdom pursued intricate policies on trade, political, and military relations with a number of foreign powers. Its successor, the Thonburi or Bangkok Empire, significantly expanded its power in the region by maintaining the emphasis on diplomacy. So as a matter of fact, the current dynasty, the Chakri dynasty, is founded on this empire and consolidated most of the Thai kingdoms and gave rise to the modern Siamese state. Moreover, despite numerous difficulties with European rivals for controls of the region, Siam emerged in the 20th century as the only country in Southeast Asia never to have been colonized, undoubtedly in large part because of its ability to play off European adversaries through skillful diplomacy. Hence, as we will further discuss later, much of Thailand's 20th century alliances have involved careful calculation of its foreign policy vis-a-vis securing the country's national independence that has been described as a blend of prudence, pragmatism, and cynical opportunism. Similarly, Likit Deravijan, a Thai political scientist and democracy advocate, acknowledges the flexible features in the conduct of Thailand's foreign policy. As explained by Deravijan, Thailand's intrinsic flexible nature is a result of its geographical location as a buffer state between foreign powers. and the intelligence and perceptiveness of the Siamese kings. He argues that the primary goal of Thailand's monarchs was to preserve Siam's national interest, which pertains to securing national sovereignty and territorial integrity, while minimizing foreign influence into domestic affairs. To connect the 2 points on national and territorial sovereignty, we can refer to Pavin Chachavalapongpun's explanation that Thailand has integrated the achievement of Thai diplomacy as a vital component of its mission to build the nation, which emphasizes Thailand's distinctive qualities from other countries. Accordingly, this explains why Thailand's success against colonization, being the only Southeast Asian country to remain independent, has been much celebrated by both the Thai state and its citizenry. Thailand's escape from colonialism has been the benchmark of Thai foreign policy. To emphasize that national sovereignty must be the ultimate goal in the conduct of diplomacy. Unsurprisingly, the notion of sovereignty has been intertwined with the agenda of nationalism. Throughout Thai history, leaders have used the concept of national sovereignty and territorial integrity to stimulate nationalism among Thai citizens in order to maintain legitimacy for authoritarian regimes and also to gain support for the interests of the regime. The threat of losing national sovereignty has molded the Thai psyche to become tolerant towards military regimes to guarantee national independence. Hence, this type of nationalism has largely influenced the direction of Thai foreign policy. On the other hand, Tira Charunvatanakun disagrees with the contentions of Kislenko and Chachavalapongpun that Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition was imposed to prevent colonization. Rather, he argues that the transformations made by Siam during the 19th century were done to assert recognition from the Western world, wherein Siam's non-Western traditions were deemed backward, barbaric, and uncivilized, and therefore serve as a catalyst for Siamese elite to conform. Charunvatanakun adheres to the analysis of renowned Thai historian Tongchai Winichakun that, and I quote, in order to survive not from colonialism but from indignity and inferior existence and to remain majestic, Siam need a confirmation according to the new ethos of civilization that is measured up to the other leading countries. The desire and anxiety to keep up with the world, not an escape from being colonized, was significant in itself, end of quote. Charunvatanakun further notes that if the adaptation of Siamese elites to Western standards of civilization were solely prompted by a pretense to avoid colonization, how can subsequent and continuous reforms to gain global recognition be explained until the modern period, long after the transformative era of Mongkut and Chulalongkorn? The development of bamboo diplomacy. For this section, the research question would be, how has Thailand's foreign policy grounded on bamboo diplomacy developed through time? The origin of Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition has been likened by Pongpisut Busbarat to the legacy of the Hindu-Buddhist cosmological concept of mandala, which illustrates the ancient state system in mainland Southeast Asia. The system of mandala dictates that smaller polities must concede to the superiority of more powerful kingdoms and submit themselves as tributaries. It should be emphasized that stronger kingdoms were perceived simultaneously as potential threats to the survival of weaker polities, and in return, stronger kingdoms had been effective counterbalancers to guarantee the autonomy of weaker polities. Accordingly, the loyalty of weaker polities was not exclusive to one of the stronger kingdoms, but was shared among multiple power entities. As a result, a system of which there were intersecting spheres of influence over smaller polities have emerged. An example will be how Siam, or Thailand, and Annam, or Vietnam, were recognized by Khmer kings as their patrons by sending tributes during the 15th to the 19th centuries. The mandala concept of state interaction has been further enforced by Siamese authorities in its responses to security challenges, following the mid-19th century arrival of European colonial powers. Thereafter, the ability to assess the external environment and maintain flexibility became a core value in the conduct of Thai foreign policy. The principle of flexibility that is epitomized by the bamboo diplomacy tradition enables Thailand to achieve two goals. First, avoid conflict with a major power, and second, maintain the status quo with regard to the country's sovereignty and security. In essence, Thailand understands its relative insignificance in great power politics, and that it could be abandoned by a great power ally at any time. Thus, Thailand needs to maneuver its relations with external powers so that it will not be negatively affected by their rivalry. This dimension reflects the realist paradigm of thought within the Thai foreign policy elite that conceives of Thailand as a small state that lacks power in quantitative terms, especially military might, and is ultimately concerned about its survival. A small power generally considers that it can never, acting alone or in a small group, make a significant impact on the system. It thus often feels threatened to some significant and immediate sense by the play of great power politics. A small state ultimately prefers neutrality and non-alignment, but realizes the difficulty in achieving that position and is therefore left with more realistic choices between balancing and bandwagoning with the great powers and diversifying its relationship with multiple powers. Therefore, the flexibility to select an appropriate foreign policy to reflect accurately the surrounding environment at a particular time is deemed necessary by Thailand's leaders. Moreover, Thai foreign policy aims as part of the state apparatus to achieve a condition that stabilizes its core pillars, which are nation, religion, uh, dominantly Buddhism, and king or monarchy, by defending the nation's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and status in the international arena. Thailand regards the ability to be flexible and pragmatic in changing its alignment as important in defending the country's national interests in response to shifts in the international distribution of power. This was clearly evident during the Cold War when Thailand shifted its foreign policy posture from maintaining contacts with both non-communist and communist countries immediately after the Second World War, then to adopting an anti-communist posture in the early 1950s, and then swinging back to the rapprochement with China during Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia in the 1980s. In another work by Pavin, he stresses that as Thailand entered the period of the Cold War, Thai leaders used the bamboo in the wind strategy to cope with the changes in the country's foreign affairs vis-a-vis regional ideological conflict. The emergence of the United States as a superpower after the Second World War served as an impetus for Thailand to endorse a pro-American foreign policy. However, it should be pointed out that internal and external circumstances reinforced Thailand's pro-American stance, ranging from the constant rise of Thai military regimes and the outbreak of the communist threat in neighboring Southeast Asian countries. And just, the United States was willing to compromise with Thailand's military regimes as long as the Thai government continues to implement an anti-communist foreign policy. In return, the alignment of Thai military regimes to the United States legitimized the role of the military in politics, in which protecting national security epitomized the conduct of Thai diplomacy. Nonetheless, as the regional balance of power shifted with the detachment between the USSR and China, as well as the departure of the United States at the end of the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia, Thailand's ruling elite needed to find a new guarantor of national security. Hence, the bamboo diplomacy tradition was once again utilized as Thailand formally established diplomatic relations with Communist China in 1975, despite Thailand's strong anti-communist stance to protect its national security. So, all of this was done at the premise of Thailand's vocal support for ASEAN to regionalize an anti-communist policy. In the post-Cold War environment, the absence of traditional security threats declined, and this enabled Thailand to pursue a more omnidirectional diplomacy. This is captured well in the remarks by former Foreign Minister Thanat Khoman in 1995. And I quote, "When we know that great powers always compete for power, we must fall into nobody's arms but maintain the policy of equidistance, not leaning too much towards anyone who will tie us so tightly that we cannot breathe comfortably. This is the principle that always guided me when I was responsible for Thai foreign affairs." In a nutshell, bending with the wind diplomacy can be observed from Thailand's ability to justify its close ties with multiple powers without being overly concerned about losing trust with or benefits from any of those powers. Bamboo diplomacy is a manifestation that Thai leaders came to terms with their country's capabilities and acted eagerly in response to the reality, rather than to idealist goals or their own ambitions. They made foreign policy based on practicality, seeing the country in terms of its history, form of government, and relationship with foreign powers. Meanwhile, Thai leaders pursued a conventional strategy of adjusting to whatever stance that best maintained relations with great powers. Opportunism, alliance, and bandwagoning were vital elements of this strategy. Thai leaders also learned to be assertive if situations permitted and to be compliant when choices in foreign policy seemed to be inadequate. Apart from its ability to maintain independence throughout the period of European expansion, Thailand's ability to form an alliance with China during the Cambodian crisis in the 1980s, while at the same time preserving a formal treaty alliance with the United States, is a classic example of the flexibility and pragmatism practiced by Thailand's foreign policy elite. In the post-Cold War era, although Thailand's security alliance with the US remains a significant component of its national security strategy, Thailand has attempted to diversify its security partnerships with other external powers, as well as within ASEAN-led multilateral frameworks. Thailand has also expanded its economic and cultural ties with various partners, particularly China. With the exception of its alliance with the US during the height of the Cold War, Thailand has been relatively consistent with its omnidirectional diplomacy. This corresponds to the overarching strategy of enmeshment that Southeast Asian states have pursued in response to changes in the regional security environment, underpinned by the US strategic drift away from Southeast Asia alongside the growing influence of China. This foreign policy posture has allowed Thailand to bend in whichever direction the wind may offer benefits to advance its natural interests. Thus, the flexibility attempts to create a win-win situation whereby Thailand does not have to choose sides and consequently lose any external support, trust, or economic benefits. For the last section, the role of bamboo diplomacy in contemporary time. So this answers the research question on how effective is Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition as a foreign policy strategy. A reduced United States presence was not the only major phenomenon in the post-Cold War period. There have been a number of rising international trends that required Thailand to rethink its traditional foreign policy, which thus far was primarily concerned with the state and the quest to protect its national sovereignty. The New World Order is the world of multipolarity, a world with several balancing centers of power driven by the force of globalization. In Southeast Asia, the emergence of new regional and multilateral platforms has gradually eroded the traditional concept of state sovereignty. An outcome to this development is the diversification of actors, like the non-governmental organizations and multinational conglomerates, as well as increasingly important non-traditional issues and challenges such as environmental protection, humanitarian disaster relief, terrorism, and epidemics. Under these circumstances, the need to redefine what constituted national interest to survive the latest shift in international politics was imperative. Domestic conditions equally contributed to the remolding of perceptions of national interest. Traditionally, Thailand's foreign policy decision-making process was dominated by a tiny elite in the military and the bureaucracy. Together, they often depicted the international environment as a highly dangerous domain filled with uncertainties. With the compelling thrust to safeguard national security in their minds, the Thai elite has been searching for protection from outside powers, and by doing so, it legitimized their role in foreign policy formulation. According to Chachavalapongpun, this justifies why Thai leaders were reluctant to abandon the traditional concept of bamboo diplomacy, even after the end of the Cold War. They feared that they could lose their legitimacy in the conduct of diplomacy. Going back to the work of Busparat, he critiques the contemporary nature of Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition, specifically its capacity to bend with the wind. Busparat contends that the present nature of Thai foreign policy has slightly shifted from bamboo bending with the wind into bamboo swirling with the wind. For Busparat, bamboo swirling with the wind suggests a foreign policy decision-making process that is highly sensitive to the surrounding external environment and tends to change abruptly in response to immediate pressures. Unlike bamboo bending with the wind, which is a well-thought and well-crafted strategy. For our two sub-questions, first one, in the present context of global politics in which US-China relations is still tense, can Thailand's bamboo diplomacy tradition still be considered as an effective foreign policy strategy? And the second one, is there a deviation from the bamboo diplomacy tradition under the government of Prayut Chan-o-cha, or is still reinforced? Busparat emphasizes that throughout history, Thailand simply bends to any direction the wind blows, while maintaining a firm stance on Thailand's national interests. In recent years, Busparat claims that the conduct of Thai foreign policy is lacking a well-planned strategy, and some of its policies are actually required the sacrifices and compromises of Thailand's national interests. In essence, Thailand is willing to bend at a new direction without establishing a long-term strategy that values its core national interests. For instance, Busparat asserts that Thailand does not have a well-crafted strategy to counterbalance and maintain friendly relations with both China and the US in the age of Sino-US competition in Southeast Asia. Thai foreign policy is viewed as being more reactive than planned. Emphasizing how Thailand's changing political climate affects its relations with the US and China, Ian Story argues that Thailand's present relationship with the US have significantly deteriorated, while a closer relationship with China has quickly emerged since Prayut Chan-o-cha's ascension to power during the May 2014 coup d'etat. The rise of Prayut has signified an impediment between US-Thai defense cooperation, a primary agenda of the Obama administration to increase America's presence in Asia and strengthen bilateral alliances. While China and many other Asian countries regarded the coup as Thailand's internal affairs, Western countries, and especially the United States, have repeatedly criticized the military seizure of power. Following the coup, Washington downgraded its bilateral ties with Thailand and enacted tough measures to pressure the junta into restoring democracy, including the suspension of military assistance and arms sales and scaling down the annual Cobra Gold military exercise, which have been held annually since 1982. Prior to the May 2014 coup, Thailand has given America access to its air and naval facilities. The current restrictions imposed by the Thai government proves detrimental to the US, where access to alternative military facilities in other mainland Southeast Asian countries, such as Vietnam and Myanmar, have also been constrained. In contrast to US-Thai relations, Sino-Thai relations have improved since the coup. This can be attributed to the China's hands-off approach to Thailand's domestic political situation, and instead aims on strengthening economic ties and defense cooperation. Under the current military regime, Thailand is trying to play the China card against the United States. To conclude our discussion, I would like to raise the following points. Thailand is clearly not a very large or powerful country that could effectively resist major powers' influence independently. Nonetheless, Thailand's future economy and security should not overly rely on relationships with the US and China. Thailand's productive and cordial relations with many countries can prevent Thailand from becoming too dependent on either of these two great powers. To avoid being drawn into the growing China-US competition, Thailand needs to diversify its foreign relations by strengthening relations with other major powers and middle powers, while also deepening its engagement with multilateral institutions, including ASEAN. The ASEAN Economic Community will continue to bring Thailand significant potential for economic development, while the ASEAN Regional Forum will increasingly become a key platform for the promotion of regional security cooperation. Thailand should actively seek greater engagement through these mechanisms to preserve and enhance its economic and security interests. Similarly, Thailand should maintain its security practice of balancing power in the region through its strategic new equilibrium of the Asia-Pacific policy promoted by Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, by seeking for new strategic partners with other major powers and middle powers, bilaterally and multilaterally, to reduce the impact of tensions from competing with great powers such as the US and China. Thank you very much. That ends my discussion. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer. Thank you.